Production funding is provided by A. Reddix and Associates, Health Information Resource Center, offering short-term training for long-term professional careers in medical coding. HIRCVA.net.
Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
Hello everyone, I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Welcome to Another View. 'Tis the season for budget planning. Many companies, nonprofits, cities, and school systems are in the process of budgeting for 2012, including Norfolk Public Schools. NPS has submitted a budget to the city that is $16.8 million leaner than the current year and includes the closing of 2 schools. But the good news is class size will not increase. So what does this mean in terms of educating Norfolk's children? What's the plan for next year? Joining to talk about it is Dr. Richard Bentley, Superintendent of Norfolk Public Schools, and one of our favorite guests, Dr. Kirk Houston, Chairman of the Norfolk School Board. Welcome to Another View, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be here.
Glad you're here, finally.
Yeah, there we go. Exactly.
So, a lot of hard work to pull the budget. We lost some state funding, right? Had to make some other cuts. Talk a little bit about the process, first from your perspective and then from yours, Dr. Houston.
Sure. Arriving here, we found out that I found out that we were dealing with a big, huge gap in terms of our budget, in terms of spending and needs and things of that nature. We found out that it started out as 22.2 million, and then it has reduced a little bit over time due to state fundings and those kinds of things. And so we put together a team of staff, representatives from schools and representatives from our 2 teacher associations and a variety of folks called the Budget Resource Allocation Team. They started working way back in September and started to say, what are our areas that we need to focus on? In that context, we developed a 4-tiered model of things that kind of helped us in guiding the work that we needed to do. This was done in conjunction with this school board as we move forward with the work. And the tier model was things that are required by law, things that are good to have that support the mission of the district, things that are nice to have, and things that are we may not need to have as we go forward as we start to look at a reduced funding. So all that work's been happening in the background. The school board's working on it. It's been a really intriguing process.
So, but you did get everybody involved. It's not or as many people.
We got
as you
a
could
large group involved. It wasn't. I wouldn't say we had everybody on the planet involved,
Right.
but we sought input from a wide variety of constituents and stakeholders in our community.
Okay, but Dr. Houston, ultimately it's up to the school board, is it not?
Absolutely. And stewardship is mainly our responsibility as we are accountable to the city and to the citizens to be sure that we are managing the resources in a responsible manner while providing the best and highest quality education we can to our children.
Now you all went through kind of line by line and did a lot of cuts, but you still wound up deciding to ask the city for a little more money. Yes?
We did. Once the administration does their, I'll use the term vetting, so to speak, and presents options to the school board, and then we begin to look at the options that are on the table, the priorities, the impact of the cuts on the various areas of educating our children, and try to determine what we can and can't live without this particular year. And we ended up about $822,000 short of the goal we were aiming to meet to balance the budget, so to speak.
So have you heard from Marcus Jones? Do we know if the city's going to be able to come through yet, or
well, the city is
too premature?
They're involved in their process at this point, and they'll be doing budget hearings and discussion and dialogue in May, so we'll find out more information as we go forward.
Yes. Okay, so one of the things that happened out of this process is the closing of 2 schools, yes. Oakwood Elementary and Dreamkeepers Academy. That's always got to be tough, I would imagine, to close the school. Thought behind why those 2 and how you plan to smooth it out in terms of where the other students go.
Okay, well, certainly closing a school is a difficult thing because schools are the fabric of our community. It's not something that we set up and say, well, we're going to close the school tomorrow morning, and it's a lot of thought and background and work that goes into it. And I'm going to recall one of the meetings we had where a board member said to me, you know, doing it on paper is a lot different than doing it for real. And there is a big, huge difference in both of those things. Oakwood was a school that was scheduled to close anyways. So there was some, prior to my arrival here when Dr. Houston was on the board, There was a dialogue about building, we're building Crossroads Elementary School, and as Crossroads would come online, the new Crossroads Elementary, the children from Oakwood would be transferred over to Crossroads, and we would eventually close that school. And if you look at the community, as I understand it, it's changed significantly, that portion of the community over time, and so that was kind of that was something we just accelerated. The Dreamkeepers one was something that the board engaged in, the building committee on the board, and dialogued about, if we have to close the school, what are the ramifications? And Dr. Houston, I know, can talk a little bit more about that from his perspective as the board chair.
It is definitely one of the most difficult decisions that a school board has to make. Of course, this is not something that was done overnight. We had been looking at school closures over, well, this is my second year on the board, and we talked a lot about it last year. A part of the long-range planning of school districts is to look at the condition of the buildings, the enrollment, and how we can best serve the students in those particular communities with regards to, and we'll talk about climate in a moment, and buildings have a lot to do with climate in schools. And so we engaged in a good process of meeting with the community after deciding that it was definitely a very viable option, meeting with the community, sharing with them how we were seeking to improve the work of the schools in closing those two schools, and how with the future plans for building new schools will provide a better physical environment for all of our students as we move forward.
The Dreamkeepers had a special program. I mean, they were working with kids kind of in a different way, along the model of an achievable dream over at Newport News and so forth. So will that program come back at some point, or?
Well, unfortunately, that program was removed last year because of reductions in revenue, and so that actual program was no longer in existence. So
that wasn't even a factor for this school year. Then,
no, it wasn't. But interestingly enough, because that program had existed there for a number of years, the parents and the students and the community members still saw that school as a very special school for the children, and that mindset that was still very much prevalent there, even though the actual program
was gone.
Yes.
So I understand the students will go to different schools that are close by.
Yes.
But what happens to the teachers and administrators when you close the school?
When we close the school, what we do is we go through a reduction in force process, and teachers follow kids. So you look at numbers of students in schools, number of kids in classrooms, and you start to decide, how many kids are going to be in each classroom, how many children are there, how many teachers do you need to have. A technical term is a full-time equivalent, and then teachers will be then moved to different schools where we have the need to where the kids are. So
they could possibly go to the neighborhood school.
They could,
or they could go someplace else, depending on what the need what the need is. One of the cuts also was in literacy. Resource teachers, and with us having such a difficulty with teaching our kids to read, kind of what's the plan to make that continue even despite the budget cuts?
Well, our academics team, one of the pieces that they did is they went through an analysis of all the different programs, and one of the things that they discovered is there were a lot of extra hands in some of these classrooms, and not to say that they weren't doing good work, they are, and they're very important. Unfortunately, you have to start to say, can we support our means and all those sorts of things. So there were cuts all across the district. It wasn't just in one specific area. That particular area, we have communication specialists that are in the schools already, and there was a perceived duplication in some respects of services. And then we went back and looked at the data over the last several years when the literacy teachers started, how long, what their effectiveness has been, and the effectiveness, we felt like we could do a little bit better job and keep focused on reading with the kids. That's an important part. Every elementary school teacher that I know of, and most of the principals and assistant principals, have a very strong background in reading. And so you've got a whole group of people there, and then we have our communication specialists that can pick up some of that load as well.
So when people hear that a specialty is going away, that doesn't necessarily mean that discipline is gone.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely not.
And I think that's really important for people who may not understand the whole process. They just hear a piece and then they think, oh my gosh, nobody's there to teach my kid to read. That's not the case.
That's absolutely not the case.
Dr. Houston, we've had you on the show before because I know that male retention, particularly African American male retention, is an important subject to you. How will will it be affected at all in terms of next year's budget and the things that we're doing to improve that?
do we think it will be
in other words,
hindered?
Will it be hindered at all?
No, not at all. Actually, I believe the ARs that we're going to talk about will really help us to drill down and really begin to pay more attention to some of those subgroups that are having particular challenges and deficiencies in some of those core content areas, especially in the areas of reading and math. And so a whole part of the budget process is not just looking at numbers and balancing the budget, but it's looking at impact on the delivery of education and how even with diminishing revenue or reductions in revenue, how we can still improve the work of educating our children. And as you were talking about the literacy teachers, you know, in times of plenty, we get used to maybe doing a job with 80 persons, and then we have to begin looking in times of famine at how we do the same job or better with, say, 60 or 50 people. And none of us like change, especially when it means having to do more with less. But we have to become more creative, look at the models that we're using, the approaches that we're using, and sometimes this kind of change forces us to examine and assess the effectiveness of what we're doing in ways that perhaps we would not if we didn't have.
If they continue.
Exactly.
Exactly. Speaking of AR, since Dr. Houston brought it up,
sure.
Those are achievable results.
Absolutely.
When you came to the school system, you devised a plan. You looked at 3 areas that you wanted to focus on. Can you tell us?
You bet, Barbara. We work collaboratively with the school board and with a group with Panasonic and the school district, and said, you know, there are things that are important to our schools, and we don't have the facilities or the energy or we want to do all things, but let's get focused on the things that are really important. So we started looking at that dropout rate, and it was very alarming. I remember getting a report in September showing 25% of our young African American males were dropping out of school.
We did a whole show on that.
Frightening.
Yes,
I mean, and so we started focusing on those things that are important to our school, and the first thing we started focusing on is on-time graduation.
Okay.
And kids, when they start school, graduating within the 12 years or 13 years if they're in kindergarten, and reaching that point of graduation. And I would qualitatively add that it's not just graduating, getting your nose over the line, but being prepared to take on the challenges of being an adult, whether you go into business or work or university or trade school or military or whatever pathway you go after high school. We want our children, they need to be able to read, they need to be able to write, they need to be able to do math, and they need to be able to think, and they need to be able to work collaboratively. I mean, we find that more and more that becomes more and more important. So that's that's our first AR, that's our first priority in these 3 ARs.
On-time graduation.
Absolutely.
The second one is
about accreditation and meeting adequate yearly progress. The state of Virginia, Commonwealth, excuse me, of Virginia has a plan that says schools have to achieve a certain level in terms of academic testing, the SOLs, in order to meet accreditation. There are other things that are involved with that, attendance, graduation rate, things of those nature. So we have a team. In fact, the board received a report last night on how we're doing with the schools that we call focus schools, schools that are maybe having a little more difficulty. What kind of resources do we put into schools to help them achieve those on-time, not the on-time graduation, but the accreditation?
Last year we had a couple of schools. I know Lafayette Winona was one of them. Where are we in that process? Are we waiting for this year to see if everyone is fully accredited?
Yes, it's actually a 1 year. It happens annually. So we track that with a variety of data. For instance, we use grade data. We have quarterly assessments, benchmark assessments, things of those.
So you already have a sense of where the schools are.
Absolutely. And so last night, as I mentioned, the board received a report from our academics team about progress of schools that we're focusing on, so that accreditation, the federal law is the AYP, or adequate yearly progress. And again, one of the things I think the community needs to understand, though, is that there are hundreds of little indicators within that. I mean, I don't know the exact number because it's pretty mind-boggling. But when you look at all those indicators, you have to hit a plus mark in each of those indicators to meet the accreditation. You can't
just
to make AYP, and a lot of people kind of combine those two together, and they're separate.
Exactly.
Accreditation and
so
AYP.
There's one for the feds, and there's one for the Commonwealth.
So you can be accredited, but not making AYP.
Exactly.
I see.
And so that happens sometimes. But if you miss one indicator, you don't meet AYP.
Right.
And so it's really quite interesting to see. I don't know how many professions actually have that, where you have to hit 100% of the indicators to be considered an achieving school.
Wow. Before we leave that point, if a parent has a child that is at a school that did not meet accreditation, should they freak out? I mean, in other words, I'm asking you all, how do you calm a parent to say your child is still getting a good education? You know, if that in fact is the case. Because I think when people hear, well, your school's not accredited, that must mean that you're doing something wrong.
Yeah, no, they shouldn't freak out. I mean, should they be concerned? Absolutely. And the parents should be concerned. Everyone should be concerned in the community if a school isn't accredited. But accreditation, again, is based on an average score in particular areas of the SOL testing. And so if you don't have, and I think it's 75.
It varies from test to test.
Okay. So you need a certain number of students scoring at a certain amount on that particular test for that school to be, to make accreditation. Your child may not be, your child may be passing.
At a very high rate.
Exactly.
But because the rest of the kids may or may not be passing.
Exactly.
That's where that falls in. So what can a parent, I assume that a parent needs to kind of help focus their kids to encourage them to study as much as they can and to do what they need to do to pass those SOLs.
I think, Barbara, it's beyond passing SOLs, though. It's the simple act of saying, when your child comes home from school, what did you do in school today?
Right.
What happened in school today? Tell me a little bit about what you're learning. Getting engaged with what children learn. The other part is children being able to talk about what they're learning, rather than being passive receptors of knowledge, being active and engaged in the process so that they understand, these are the things I'm really well in. I can do these things really well, and these are things I really need to work on. I mean, we're human beings. We have glows and we have grows. Exactly.
And that's such a good point. And you know, grandparents are probably a little different than parents. I'm a grandparent now.
Me too.
And I have that conversation several times a week with my granddaughter, and it helps her process. It helps her. It stimulates her interest. She was just sharing with me the other day, you know, how light travels versus how sound travels from a lesson in school. Now, as a result of having that conversation, I'm certain that on the test, you know, classroom tests as well as SOL testing, that she'll do far better than a kid who doesn't have that conversation at home.
So that brings us to our third point, and we only have a couple minutes left, but that's the community involvement, the community engagement piece of that. What do you need from the Norfolk community as well as the Hampton Roads community? Because, you know, unfortunately, Norfolk sometimes gets a bad rap in terms of the school system. I think it's turning around and it's changing, but what do you need from the community?
Get involved, participate, be a part of. We know that sometimes parents and community members are worried. They say, well, maybe they didn't have a great experience in school. You know, push that aside and say, let's see if we can help the next generation be a part of. Join hands with us. Ask us questions. Hold us accountable. When we fall down, don't kick us. Help us get back up, but be a part with us.
And I got to ask you guys, because I would be remiss, especially on this show, if I don't ask about what happened at Sewell's Point. And I will just give you all, we got about 3 minutes left, to just give me your perspective on, you know, how that could happen, and then where are we in terms of making sure it doesn't happen again.
Well, we're right now at the very front end of looking into that situation, and there's certainly a lot of parameters and information that we need to collect from the individuals, the children, the teacher, the staff that were over there, to understand the fullness of it. But I will say this, I mean, the school board, Dr. Houston and I both agree with this, is that we do not condone anything of that nature. I mean, that kind of activity is certainly not something that as a school district we would condone. I think a statement that Dr. Houston read last night at the end of the school board meeting really summed that up.
That is that we don't justify or condone any behavior with our teachers that involves dehumanization of any kind related to racism, sexism, or any kind of discrimination.
So where do we go? You're new. You having a good time?
Absolutely, every single day. I wake up every morning, I go, what am I going to get to do today, and what am I going to learn, and how am I going to make a difference?
You came from Texas. Virginia's very different, I would imagine. But when you were in El Paso, that was still in an urban setting?
Absolutely.
Okay, so your philosophy overall about urban schools?
Well, first off, children need to know that people love them and care for them. They need to understand that there are people that are in schools that are there to help them. They have deficits sometimes. They come to us with a lot of things that are maybe lacking, and we have a responsibility to help them overcome some of those deficits that may exist. It's not impossible. I've seen it happen in a lot of different communities, and I think it certainly can happen here, and it has happened here in Norfolk.
I think that's refreshing a little bit, because sometimes people say schools should not be in the business of taking care of the other social ills, but how do you make that separation? You can't really.
Oh, yeah, you absolutely can. And one of the big moves afoot now is whole person, whole student education that takes into consideration both the social, emotional, and physical needs of our children. And we're going to have to take that approach as we see more budget cuts, the big debates going on in Washington. I think schools are going to have to become more responsible, families, churches, and consider all the holistic needs of our children.
That takes us back to that third point again. We got to get the community
Engage
involved,
the community.
engage the community.
Absolutely.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm sure we will be talking more as the year goes on. And I have to admit, my daughter graduated from Norfolk Public Schools. I'm a big fan, so I will just say that. And when we come back, the story of a man and his brush and the art he creates. But first, here's what's happening in Hampton Roads. With the stroke of a brush, a Hampton man has turned a hobby into a career. Artist Gerome Meminger uses vibrant colors and passionate strokes to create beautiful abstract art. But as our Lisa Godley found out, his talent doesn't stop with putting paint to canvas. Gerome Meminger also uses his gift to illustrate books and create quite an impressive clothing line.
You can sit and procrastinate about it and say, you know, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. Just do it. If you're satisfied with it, then that's the main thing. You satisfy yourself first.
Gerome Meminger hasn't been an artist long. In fact, painting is his second career. But boy, has it been an exciting ride so far. Gerome Meminger is a self-taught artist. He says after searching 9 months for a piece of artwork and not being able to find exactly what he wanted, he decided to paint it himself. Well, the rest is history.
So my first painting I did is called Tiger, and I was satisfied with it. I framed it, and I painted maybe 10 other pieces, and I put them in the closet. And some friends came from D.C., and I was proud of my first painting, and I showed it to them. And my wife said, well, show them the other pieces. They raved about them, and they wanted copies of them.
Just walk through Gerome's gallery and you'll see just how his creativity explodes on the canvas. From safety pins to a toilet seat, this artist doesn't pass up the opportunity to create art.
It's titled Broken Glass Everywhere, and I was framing another painting to go in here, and I'm not the best glass cutter in the world, so I broke about 4 sheets of glass, and then I threw it into the trash.
Gerome put many of his first paintings on bookmarks and wrote poems to accompany the images. His fans kept asking for more. That's when he knew it was time to write a poetry book featuring his art. He says people would introduce him as an author, but he still didn't feel like one.
So I decided to write The Lonely Little Blue Book, which is now in Barnes & Nobles along with the poetry book, to get children interested in going to the library and picking up a book to read.
In fact, Gerome had just finished a storytelling about the Little Blue Book when he met world-renowned artist Wyland.
We exchanged books. And I told him I had a gallery in downtown Hampton, and he said, oh, I'm going to try to come by there. And then I said, as busy as this man is, because Wyland, he paints all of the murals on the buildings all throughout the world. So he came into my gallery, and he told me he was blown away with my style of art. He called me one day, and he told me, Gerome, I want to do a collaboration with you. And then I said, whoa. He was invited by Florida National Forestry to do something to represent the year of the forest. And he said, I want you to paint the trees and then leave a third of the painting blank, and then I'll do the filling in with my water scenes and with animals. That should really spark something big.
And this story is far from over. because people aren't just buying Gerome Meminger's art, they're literally asking him for the shirt off his back.
I would do a painting on a shirt as an advertisement. I got asked so many times about my t-shirts and stuff, so I said I think I'll try to do something like that on shirts, and that's become pretty successful.
At this rate, who knows where Art by Gerome will pop up next. For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
And that's our show for this evening. We'd love to hear from you. Become a fan on Facebook or let us know your thoughts at anotherview.tv. Next week, a candid conversation with retired Police Chief Bruce Marquis. We'll see you next time for Another View.
Production funding is provided by A. Reddix and Associates, Health Information Resource Center, offering short-term training for long-term professional careers in medical coding. HIRCVA.net.